Okay. Hello, my name is Chase Kiel, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Opium Wars. A little background about this topic. Going into this project, I'd never even heard of the Opium Wars, but upon doing months and months of research on it, I'm very excited to show you everything I've learned and everything about these wars, because they're very interesting. So, what was the first Opium War? I'm going to give you a little brief overview first. The First Opium War, which spanned from October 8th, 1839 to August 29th, 1842, was fought between China and Britain over the illegal opium trade happening in China. Basically, what was going on was British merchants had been smuggling opium into China, which caused widespread addiction and social and economic problems. And in 1839, the Chinese official Lin Zexu took drastic action by destroying large quantities of the opium that was illegally smuggled into China, but this still angered Britain. So in retaliation, Britain sent a military force to China. Overall, the war saw an absolute thrashing of the Chinese defenses by the modern and industrialized British army, who were just way more developed than China at the time. The war marked the start of a period of Western dominance over China, which became known as the Century of Humiliation. It also led to the expansion of the opium trade, further destabilizing Chinese society. Moving on to the Second Opium War. This one started on October 8th, 1856, which is almost exactly 14 years after the First Opium War ended. And the Second Opium War ended on October 24th, 1860. The Second Opium War was fought between China, once again, and this time instead of a standalone Britain, the Chinese had to fight against an alliance of Britain and France. And from the beginning, this was a losing battle for China. The war began after the Arrow incident in 1856, when Chinese officials boarded a British ship, leading to Britain demanding an apology from them. And we'll find out later. We'll find out why later. France joined the conflict seeking to expand its influence. The war's main issues were trade rights, the legalization of opium, and diplomatic privileges. The combined British and French forces captured key cities and eventually marched to Beijing. After initial peace negotiations in 1858, which China delayed, Britain and France resumed fighting, capturing Beijing in 1860 and burning the Summer Palace, which we will learn more about later. The war ended with the Treaty of Peking in 1860, which forced China to open more ports, legalize opium, and allow foreign diplomats into Beijing, further increasing Western control over China. So now let's actually get into what opium is, what these wars have been being fought over. Why was Britain so concerned about this stuff called opium, and why is China so against it, against people getting addicted to it? Well, opium is a highly addictive narcotic that comes from the poppy plant. Both of these images are the poppy plant, one obviously after it has bloomed, that being figure 1.3, figure 1.2 being when the opium plant is actually ready to secrete that juice you see there, that thick white milky stuff, is raw opium. So the flower that opium originates from is the Papaver somniferum, and it is the source for many narcotics like morphine, codeine, and heroin, which are unfortunately popular drugs today. Opium is a depressant drug, which basically means that it slows down the messages traveling between your brain and your body, giving you a sense of relief after a short-lived high. So how was this opium stuff produced? Well, as we can see in figure 1.4, that is actually a opium factory. So I'm going to get into how the opium was actually produced. First of all, opium is obtained by collecting the latex that exudes from the partially ripe seed capsule of Papaver somniferum, or the opium poppy. If you slit a capsule just after the petals have fallen, but before it is fully ripe, A thick, milky white juice will ooze from the cut and harden upon the surface into a dark brown gum. This gum is raw opium. It is secreted by the skin of the capsule, and it does not come from the seeds themselves, which are used for other common things, such as baking, like you'll see them on top of muffins, burger buns sometimes, they're like the little black poppy seeds, you know if you saw them. After careful inspection and weighing, the opium is poured into large rectangular stone vats, standing side by side in a warehouse like the one in the figure. The most common factories were in India, in territories owned by the British, which is how they got their opium to smuggle into China. The smell is said to be equivalent to that of new mown hay, but the look is more like tar. Later, in the dry weather before the rain comes, and in the dry weather after, the drug is taken out of the vats just a little at a time, carried to an open space near the high brick wall, and there it is spread in shallow wooden trays set upon concrete platforms. Mechanical stirrers on rails move noiselessly across the trays, stirring the gummy stuff to expose it fully to the air. And opium is soluble in water, so it must be hardened before it can be packed. So that sums up how the opium was produced. Now, how was opium used? Opium was most often smoked by the Chinese in long pipes made special for smoking opium. Actually, opium was not originally used as a hallucinogenic, but it was used as a remedy for things like diarrhea, dysentery, asthma, rheumatism, diabetes, malaria, cholera, fevers, bronchitis, insomnia, and really pains of any sort. It was kind of the cure-all of the time, at least in Great Britain. And at a time when the physician's cabinet was almost bare of alternative drugs, it was basically impossible to practice medicine without it. And obviously people got very addictive to this narcotic drug, which leads us to the First Opium War. Now, what was China like before the Opium Wars? Well, before the First Opium War, China was a powerful, centralized empire under the Qing dynasty, which had ruled for almost 200 years and would come to a stop in 1912. The period leading up to the First Opium War was marked by a mix of economic prosperity, internal challenges, and growing tensions with foreign powers. So, the Qing emperors held absolute power, with a well-established bureaucratic system. The dynasty was led by the Emperor Dao Guang at the time of the Opium War. The Qing dynasty faced internal unrest, including corruption, peasant revolts, and regional instability. The empire was struggling to manage its vast territory and growing population. At the time, China was largely agrarian, with farming as the main source of income, and the economy was relatively self-sufficient with limited industrialization compared to the rest of the world at the time, like Great Britain and France, which we'll talk about later. China maintained a trade surplus with Western countries, primarily importing silver and exporting goods like tea, silk, and porcelain. All things that Great Britain very, very much liked. That was in very high demand in Great Britain. Western nations, particularly Britain, had limited access to Chinese markets, which led to frustration among foreign merchants. Now, China had a high demand for silver, which was used to pay for imported goods, particularly opium. This contributed to an economic imbalance, especially as China's silver reserves dwindled due to the increasing demand for opium in China. China also had a policy of isolationism, especially regarding trade with Western nations. Foreign trade was restricted to a few coastal ports, with the major trading hub being Canton. China viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom and saw its civilization as superior. It had a tributary system, where neighboring states paid tribute to China in exchange for trade rights and protection. And despite China's attempts to limit foreign influence, British merchants had been smuggling opium into China, primarily through the port of Canton. This led to widespread addiction, and by the 1830s, opium had become a serious social and economic problem. China was also heavily influenced by Confucian ideals, which emphasized hierarchy and social order. The emperor was seen as the son of heaven, or the ultimate ruler of the world. The population of China was growing rapidly, which put pressure on resources, particularly in the rural areas. This contributed to poverty and unrest. And there was a significant gap between the elite ruling class and the peasantry, which led to tensions and dissatisfaction among the lower classes. Getting back on topic to opium itself, the British East India Company had been trading opium grown in British-controlled India for tea, silk, and other Chinese goods. By the 1830s, opium addiction had become widespread in China, affecting close to 12 million citizens, which was like 5 to 10% of the population at the time, leading to serious public health, social, and economic issues. As well as that, in the 1830s, the Qing government, alarmed by the growing addiction problem, appointed Lin Zexu, which we can see in figure 1.6 here, as the imperial commissioner to combat the opium trade. Lin took aggressive actions to destroy opium supplies, including confiscating and burning over 20,000 chests of opium in 1839, which directly led to the outbreak of the First Opium War. So now we're going to talk about some of the key characters and components from the British Empire. So as we just talked about, the British East India Company played a major role in the opium trade. The company was heavily involved in the production and illegal export of opium from India to China. By the 1830s, opium was a major part of Britain's trade with China, balancing the trade deficit created by British demand for Chinese goods like the tea, silk, and porcelain. As we can see in figure 1.7, Queen Victoria, as the head of the British Empire, Queen Victoria's government was indirectly involved. Though much of the decision-making regarding foreign trade and diplomacy was handled by British ministers, especially the Foreign Secretary and military commanders. Charles Elliot. He was the British superintendent of trade in China and played a key diplomatic role during the initial stages of the war. Elliot's actions, including his demand for compensation for British merchants and support for the military response to China, were crucial in escalating tensions between Britain and China. Lord Palmerston. The British Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister, at the time of the war, Palmerston was a strong advocate for British imperial interests. He supported the use of military force to protect British merchants and ensure free trade in China. Now, obviously, the Opium War, we have our opium traders, which were British merchants, and they were the primary drivers of the opium trade, with many of them operating through the British East India Company. The traders, including individuals like William Jardine and James Matheson, who later founded the Jardine-Matheson Company, were immensely wealthy and influential. The economic stakes for these merchants were enormous, and they lobbied the British government to intervene when China took action against the opium trade. Now let's move on to the Chinese side, where we have some key characters from the Qing dynasty. So we can see Emperor Dao Guang here in figure 1.8. His role, he was the ruler of the Qing dynasty during the First Opium War. He reigned from 1820 to 1850 and faced numerous challenges, including widespread corruption, increasing foreign influence, and internal unrest. Some of the challenges he faced were that Dao Guang's reign was marked by a growing opium crisis. Despite China's self-sufficiency, the opium trade drained China's silver resources and created widespread addiction, as we've talked about before, The emperor also had to contend with corruption within the bureaucracy and widespread social unrest, which would culminate in the Taiping Rebellion after his death. His position on the opium trade, Daoguang initially resisted reforms and held the traditional view of China as a self-sufficient and resistant to foreign influence. He relied on his advisors like Lin Zexu to take action against the opium trade through his policies, and it ultimately led to the war with Britain. Moving on to Lin Zexu. So Lin Zexu was an imperial commissioner tasked with eradicating the opium trade in Canton by Emperor Daoguang. He is one of the most famous and influential figures in the history of Qing China, and is often seen as a patriot who tried to protect China from foreign exploitation. He was appointed in 1839 to deal with the escalating opium crisis. Lin took drastic measures to curb the trade in Canton. He ordered the destruction of over 20,000 chests of opium, as I mentioned before, that had been seized from the British merchants. He also initiated a crackdown on opium smokers and dealers, closing foreign trading factories and even ordering the closure of the port for foreign trade. This aggressive stance was aimed at protecting Chinese society from the devastating effects of opium addiction. Moving on to Zhuo Zongtang. So, while Zhuo Zongtang was not directly involved in the First Opium War, he became a prominent Qing official in the aftermath and played a critical role in the later stages of the Qing dynasty. Zhuo is often remembered for his leadership during the Taiping Rebellion, which wouldn't take place until 1850. He also played a key role in the rebuilding of China's military after the dynasty's humiliations by the West, which would take place after the First Opium War. Zongtang is often viewed as a symbol of Qing resistance to foreign domination and a reformer who sought to modernize China. He later oversaw the reconstruction of Xinjiang and was instrumental in rebuilding China's military-industrial capacity. So Zhuo wasn't so much a key component in the First Opium War, but in the rebuilding, he was essential, and he was seen as an influential political figure that people could look up to and have hope. Okay, moving on to the key events and major battles of the First Opium War, we are first going to be talking about the destruction of the opium in Canton. So, the immediate cause of the war was the actions of Lin Zexu, who was appointed to stop the illegal opium trade, and in March 1839, Lin took aggressive steps to eliminate the opium trade by confiscating and destroying the massive amount of British opium that was stored in Canton, roughly 20,000 chests of opium, which amounted to about 1,000 tons of the drug. Lin also ordered the closure of British merchant factories in Canton, effectively halting all British trade. The destruction of the opium and the subsequent diplomatic dispute over compensation for the British merchants was a direct catalyst for the war, and Britain did not respond in a good manner. So in response to Lin's actions, Britain demanded compensation for the destroyed opium and the right to resume the illegal trade of the opium. Of course, the Qing court refused, viewing Lin's actions as justified, and the situation then escalated. Britain then used this as a pretext to launch military action, claiming that China had violated international law by destroying British property. So, some British preparations. At the time, the British Empire had one of the most powerful navies in the world. In response to the situation in Canton, the British government sent a military expedition to China. The British forces were well equipped with modern steam-powered warships and advanced artillery, which gave them a decisive advantage over the Chinese forces who weren't so far modernized as the British. The British fleet, under the command of Admiral Sir William Parker and the military leadership of Major General Sir Hugh Gough, was tasked with imposing Britain's demands by force. The British forces included a combination of naval vessels and ground troops, which were well prepared for coastal warfare. And these preparations bring us to the first battle of the Opium War, the Battle of Kowloon. The Battle of Kowloon is often seen as one of the first military confrontations in the First Opium War. The battle itself was a naval engagement and occurred near the Bogue, also known as the Chuempi forts, at the mouth of the Pearl River, just outside of Canton. We'll talk more about Chuempi later, it is important. The Chinese had fortified this area to prevent foreign ships from entering the river and reaching Canton, which was the principal point of trade. So, the Chinese had built a series of coastal forts to defend the mouth of the Pearl River. These were positioned strategically to protect Canton, which was one of China's most important trading cities. The forts were armed with cannons and manned by Chinese soldiers, but they were not equipped with the same level of firepower or advanced military technology as the modernized British forces. In addition to the land defenses, the Chinese also deployed a fleet of war junks, or traditional Chinese ships, in an attempt to prevent British ships from entering the river and attacking Canton. As far as the British fleet goes, the British forces under the command of Admiral Sir William Parker consisted of several advanced steam-powered warships and sailing vessels, including the HMS Modest and the HMS Liffey, as well as other British vessels. The British Navy was highly modernized compared to the Chinese fleet, which relied on outdated sailing ships. They didn't have steam-powered vessels. Britain had superior guns, faster movement, better coordination, better tactics. The British utilized their naval superiority, particularly their ability to move swiftly and deliver heavy firepower from a distance, which the Chinese lacked. So let's get into the actual engagement itself. The British forces approached the Bogue forts with the intention of forcing the Chinese to open the river and allow them access to Canton. The British ships used their superior artillery and naval tactics to bombard the forts and Chinese vessels, effectively neutralizing the Chinese defenses with relative ease. The Chinese defenders, despite their resolve, were unable to effectively resist the British onslaught. The Chinese junks were no match for the firepower of the modern British steamships, and their fortifications were quickly damaged by British gunfire. The obvious outcome is that the British emerged victorious from the battle. The Chinese stood no chance. The forts were heavily damaged, and the Chinese were unable to prevent the British from advancing further along the coast. The Chinese forces suffered heavy casualties, but the British faced minimal losses thanks to their technology superiority and tactical advantage. The aftermath and some of the key lessons from the battle. The British victory at Kowloon marked a significant early success for the British Navy. The Bogue forts, which had been an important Chinese defensive position, were neutralized. The British now had the upper hand in the conflict and were free to move along China's coast and press their demands. This taught China just how badly they were behind in terms of modernization and industrialization. Britain just stomped on them and showed their dominance, while China underestimated the British, thought they weren't as modernized as they were, and which led to their defeat. And that brings us to the First Battle of Chuempi, which took place on November 3rd, 1839, during the early phase of the Opium War. This battle was another one of the first major naval clashes between the British and the Qing dynasty, and also set the stage for the escalating conflict between China and Britain. So before the battle, the British Navy, under the command of Captain Charles Elliot, was stationed off the Chinese coast near the port of Canton, and by this time the British had already begun to demonstrate their superior naval technology with steam-powered ships and advanced artillery. The Chinese were using more traditional wooden junks again, with outdated weaponry and really only short-range firepower. So on November 3rd, 1839, the British fleet, consisting of warships like the HMS Wellesley and the HMS Sulphur, approached the Boca Tigris a narrow strait near the entrance to the Pearl River, which controlled access to Canton. The Chinese had stationed a fleet of junks at Chuempi, the narrow strait, to defend the passage and prevent foreign ships from entering the river leading to Canton. The British began the battle with a heavy bombardment of the Chinese junks, whose outdated cannons were no match for the superior British firepower. The British warships used their long-range, heavy artillery to disable and destroy many of the Chinese vessels. This once again just showed the British firepower advantage. But despite being outgunned, the Chinese put up a strong resistance, firing on the British ships with their cannons and attempting to engage in close combat. However, their lack of training and the technological disparity meant that the Chinese forces were unable to mount a meaningful defense. The Chinese also had fortified positions along the coastline, but these too proved ineffective against the superior British artillery. This led to a British victory with their advanced tactics and weaponry, defeated the Chinese forces. The battle ended with the destruction or capture of several Chinese ships, while the British suffered relatively few casualties again. The Boca Tigris was secured by the British, which led to Canton, effectively placing the city under siege. In the immediate aftermath, it was another significant victory for the British, and it demonstrated the weakness of the Qing military in the face of modern technology, and this led to more British victories to come, because now they had secured the port, they had secured one of the major canals to Canton, and this would just lead to a bad time for the Chinese. And that leads us to the Battle of Canton. The Battle of Canton was fought on May 21st, 1841, and it was one of the significant engagements of the First Opium War. The capture of Canton, an economically and politically important city, demonstrated the British military strength and forced the Qing dynasty to consider the severe implications of continuing this war with Britain. The British forces were once again led by Major General Hugh Gough, and this time Commodore James Bremer. They planned an assault on Canton to force the Qing government to negotiate on British terms. The Qing government, understanding the importance of Canton, bolstered its defenses in the city, under the command of General Yang Feng and other high-ranking officials. Despite efforts to defend the city, the Chinese forces were still poorly equipped in comparison to the British, lacking any modern weaponry or industrialized steam-powered ships. So, the battle begun on May 21st, 1841. British forces began a coordinated assault by land and water. British warships bombarded Canton's coastal defenses and fortifications, overwhelming the Chinese artillery with their superior firepower. The British ground troops landed and began advancing towards the city, equipped with their modern rifles, cannons, and their disciplined training. All of which the Chinese lacked at the time, so the British forces moved quickly through Chinese positions. The Chinese defenders, including Qing soldiers and local militia, put up strong resistance in certain areas. However, the technological and organizational disparities made it difficult for the Chinese to withstand the British assault. Many Chinese defenders were armed with outdated weaponry and lacked effective military strategy, making them once again vulnerable to British attacks. The fighting eventually moved into the city itself, with British troops engaging in urban combat against the remaining defenders. Although some areas saw fierce resistance, British forces ultimately took control of key parts of the city with relative ease. By the end of the day, British forces had secured significant parts of Canton, effectively placing the city under British control. Rather than fully occupying Canton, the British commanders opted to negotiate with Chinese officials. The British demanded a ransom payment to spare the city from further destruction. The Chinese officials, eager to prevent further damage, agreed to the payment. A temporary truce was established, with Chinese officials agreeing to pay 6 million taels of silver as a ransom, and also to allow continued British trade access in the area. This truce actually marked a temporary halt in hostilities in Canton, but did not end the broader conflict. This hefty ransom payment imposed on Canton was a financial blow to the Qing government, which was already struggling with the cost of war. The fall of Canton signaled to the Qing dynasty that the British were capable of sinking the Chinese junks, and that they were capable of striking major Chinese cities. This realization forced the Qing leadership to reevaluate their strategy, though they still did not fully understand the military disparity. And that brings us to the Battle of Qinkiang, which we can see in figure 2.3. That is the city of Qinkiang. So, the final deciding battle of the First Opium War was the Battle of Qinkiang, which took place on July 21st, 1842. This battle would turn out to be a decisive victory for the British and led directly to the Qing dynasty's decision to seek peace. So, by mid-1842, the British forces had advanced up the Yangtze River after securing coastal cities and strategic river forts along the way. Qinkiang was strategically located near the Grand Canal, China's primary inland trade route, connecting the northern and southern parts of the empire. Capturing Qinkiang would give the British control over this critical point, essentially disrupting the Qing dynasty's internal logistics and communications. So, the battle itself, the British attacked Qinkiang with a combined force of naval and ground troops. The Chinese defenders, including regular Qing soldiers, prepared to defend the city. The Manchu garrison at Qinkiang, though outgunned, fought tenaciously, refusing to surrender even in the face of overwhelming British firepower. Many defenders, knowing the consequences of defeat, chose to fight to the death or take their own lives rather than surrender. The fighting was brutal, with street-to-street and hand-to-hand combat as the British advanced through the city. Despite the defenders' valiant resistance, the British ultimately captured Qinkiang, once again very easily, marking one of the most fiercely contested battles in the war. The impact on the Qing government, the capture of Qinkiang was devastating for the Qing, as it effectively gave the British control of the lower Yangtze River and cut off a vital transport and communication line. With British forces close to Nanking and threatening the heart of the empire, the Qing government realized they could no longer continue this war. And that brings us to the Treaty of Nanking, which was signed on August 29th, 1842. It was the treaty that ended the First Opium War between China and Britain. This treaty was significant for the severe terms it imposed on China, marking the beginning of what is often referred to as China's Century of Humiliation, a period of foreign dominance and influence that impacted China's sovereignty. And here is a look at some of the key terms of the treaty. First of all, the cession of Hong Kong to Britain. One of the most impactful terms of the Treaty of Nanking was the permanent cession of Hong Kong Island to Britain. This provided the British with a strategic port in East Asia that became a major commercial and naval base. Over time, Hong Kong developed it into a global trade and finance hub under British rule. Moving on to the second one, the opening of the 5 treaty ports. The treaty required China to open 5 ports to British trade and resistance: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. As well as that, we have the indemnity payments. China was forced to pay a substantial indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to Britain. This amount covered 2 main areas: the compensation for the destroyed opium seized by the Chinese commissioner Lin Zexu, and the war costs incurred by Britain during the conflict. The fourth and final item is the extraterritorial rights for British citizens. This treaty established extraterritoriality for British citizens living or working in China, meaning they would be subject to British rather than Chinese law. British nationals accused of crimes in China could be tried by British consular courts and not Chinese courts, effectively placing them outside of Chinese legal jurisdiction. So, besides the battles that we covered here today, there were many more battles fought by the Chinese and lost devastatingly. So the question is, why did they keep fighting these battles? Why didn't they agree to peace terms earlier? Well, during the First Opium War, several Qing officials deliberately downplayed the Chinese death tolls. They straight up lied to the emperor about the death tolls and the scale of British victories when reporting to the Daoguang emperor. This consistent downplaying stemmed from both fear of punishment and shame for failing in their duties, and a cultural reluctance to deliver bad news to the emperor. A major offender in this regard is Lin Zexu himself. So while Lin's actions triggered the conflict, he underreported the British military threat in early reports to the emperor. He focused on the righteousness of the king's anti-opium stance and implied that the British would not dare to engage in extensive military actions, creating a false sense of confidence. And although Lin wasn't directly involved in later battles, his initial reluctance to acknowledge British military capabilities influenced the emperor's perception that the British could be contained, despite mounting casualties. Another offender of this is Qishan. So after Lin's dismissal, Qishan was appointed as a negotiator and given the responsibility of managing British demands and Qing defenses. In his communications, Qishan often provided incomplete or missing or misleading reports on clashes with British forces. For instance, during the British attacks on Canton and surrounding areas, he downplayed Chinese losses, reporting only minor skirmishes or isolated clashes. In reality, British forces inflicted significant casualties, and Chinese defenses were largely ineffective against British weaponry, despite what Qishan would go on to say. The last major person who contributed in the lying to the emperor was Yang Feng. Yang Feng was another high-ranking official responsible for military actions in Canton. And Yang Feng sent reports that omitted the actual scale of Chinese casualties. During British assaults on Canton, he claimed that local militias and imperial troops had successfully repelled British forces with minimal loss of life on the Chinese side. We obviously know this didn't happen and the Chinese lost. They got slaughtered, actually. It was terrible. And this led to the delay of the peace treaty. So let's move on to the Second Opium War. So leading up to the Second Opium War, China was still grappling with the aftermath of the First Opium War and with the Treaty of Nanking. The changes caused by the treaty weakened Qing sovereignty, disrupted social and economic structures, and created tension with foreign powers and local populations alike. So there was still some lingering resentment from the First Opium War. Chinese was afraid of being seen as weak to the Western world. There was also the desire for treaty revision by Western powers. Britain and other Western countries, such as France and the United States, quickly found the Treaty of Nanking unsatisfactory, which would lead to problems in the future. Also, still internal instability within China. The Qing dynasty was dealing with several internal crises, most notably the Taiping Rebellion, which spanned from 1850 to 1864, which was one of the deadliest civil wars in history. Estimates of the conflict's death toll range from about 20 to 30 million. This rebellion obviously weakened the Qing government and drained resources. There was also renewed conflicts over opium and trade restrictions, which we will get into. So, the catalyst for the Second Opium War was this little incident called the Arrow Incident. So in October 1856, while the Arrow, which was a ship primarily used for cargo and transport around the Pearl River Delta, which was owned by Chinese merchants and operated by a Chinese crew, but it had temporarily registered with British authorities in Hong Kong, primarily to enjoy the security that British protection afforded in that region. So while the Arrow was docked, Chinese authorities suspected the ship's crew of involvement in piracy and smuggling. Acting on these suspicions, local Qing officials boarded the Arrow, arrested 12 Chinese crew members, and took them into custody. During the boarding, Chinese officials reportedly lowered the British flag that the ship was flying, an act that the British saw as a violation of their extraterritorial rights. And in response to this, the British were not happy. The Arrow's British registration had technically expired about 2 weeks before the incident, although the British flag was still being flown. The Arrow was not officially under British protection at the time of the incident. British officials argued, however, that the act of lowering the British flag was a deliberate insult to British sovereignty. They demanded an immediate release of the arrested crew members and an apology from the Qing government. The British officials saw the boarding of the Arrow and arrest of the crew as a violation of the Treaty of Nanking, which they were already not satisfied with, so they just were looking for a reason to initiate another war to get a further revision of the treaty to give them more trade rights. So, the reaction to this, Sir John Bowring, the British governor of Hong Kong, and Harry Parkes, the British consul in Canton, were eager to press China for greater concessions, seeing the incident as an opportunity to renegotiate the terms of trade and expand British privileges in China. As I mentioned earlier, France would be involved in this war. So how did they get involved? Well, this starts with the execution of a French missionary, otherwise known as Auguste Chapdelaine. He was killed by Chinese officials, reportedly for his evangelizing activities in an area where Christianity was restricted. Besides this, which obviously made the French mad, France had a desire for trade expansion, like Britain. France was eager to expand its trade and diplomatic privileges in China after the First Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking. And the French wanted similar access and were looking for new avenues to expand their influence in the region. France also had an alliance with Britain. By the mid-1850s, Britain was already engaged in the Second Opium War following the Arrow incident. France and Britain shared common interests in pressuring the Qing government for greater trade concessions, extraterritorial rights, and the legalization of the opium trade. Despite not having direct stakes in the opium trade, France saw an opportunity to align with Britain. Now let's move into the capture of Beijing. So in 1860, the British and French forces began a coordinated attack, advancing from Canton to Beijing. They had secured key victories, including the capture of the Taku forts in June 1860, which had previously blocked the route to Beijing. The British were led by Admiral Sir Michael Seymour and General James Hope Grant, while the French forces were commanded by General Cosson Montauban. Together they amassed a force of 20,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery. So in the battle for Beijing, the capture of the Taku forts was the first major engagement in the 1860 campaign. The Taku forts protected the entrance to the Bohai Bay near Beijing. In the first attempt to capture the forts in 1859, the British and French failed. However, in 1860, they returned with overwhelming force, capturing the forts with minimal resistance. This led to the advance to Beijing. After taking the forts, the Allied forces advanced through northern China, facing only sporadic resistance from the Qing military. The Qing forces had already been badly weakened, and their military was in disarray. This led to the capture of the city, and by October 1860, British and French forces reached Beijing. The Qing Emperor Xiongfeng had already fled the city, leaving it completely defenseless. With no significant opposition, the Allied forces entered the city and captured it. During the raid on Beijing, the burning of the Summer Palace took place, and the burning of the Summer Palace was one of the most devastating and symbolic events of the Second Opium War. Located on the outskirts of Beijing, the Summer Palace was a vast and opulent complex of gardens, palaces, and temples that had served as a seasonal residence for Chinese emperors of the Qing dynasty. The destruction of this architectural and cultural masterpiece by British and French forces in October of 1860 was an act of retaliation and a demonstration of power intended to leave a lasting message to the Qing government. And a message it left because this was the ultimate humiliation for China. All of these things combined led to the Treaty of Peking, signed in October 1860. It officially ended the Second Opium War, and it imposed new harsh terms on China. It was signed between the Qing dynasty, Britain, and France, with similar agreements for Russia and the United States. The treaty solidified foreign influence in China and forced the country into a deeper position of submission and dependency on the Western powers. The treaty's terms reflected the decisive power shift in favor of the Western imperial nations, and had long-lasting effects on China's sovereignty and international relations. So, some key provisions of the Treaty of Peking. One was the ratification of the Treaty of Tientsin. The Treaty of Tientsin was formally ratified in the Treaty of Peking, meaning all of its terms would be enforced. These would include the legalization of the opium trade, the opening of additional treaty ports, allowing foreign embassies in Beijing, marking the first time foreign nations were permitted to establish a formal diplomatic presence in the Chinese capital. Another one being the cession of Kowloon Peninsula to Britain. China ceded the Kowloon Peninsula, which is located across the harbor from Hong Kong Island, to Britain in perpetuity. This addition expanded British control in the area and solidified Hong Kong's role as a major British-controlled port. So now, not only did Britain control Hong Kong, but it now also controlled Kowloon forever. Another key provision covered on the Treaty of Peking was the opening of additional ports. The treaty required China to open Tianjin as an additional treaty port for trade. Tianjin's strategic location near Beijing and its proximity to the coast made it a valuable commercial site for foreign traders, further reducing Chinese control over its own trade. This treaty, of course, came with some indemnity payments as well. The Qing dynasty was required to pay a large indemnity of 8 million taels of silver, each to Britain and France, intended to cover the costs of war and the loss of British property, including the confiscated opium. This financial burden placed even greater strain on China's economy and contributed to internal instability within the Qing dynasty. Brings us to the fifth key provision of the Treaty of Peking, which is the extraterritorial rights and missionary protections. The treaty strengthened the extraterritorial rights granted to British and French citizens in China, meaning that they could not be prosecuted under Chinese law, but would instead be subject to their home country's legal system, as it did previously in the Treaty of Nanking. Missionary rights, French demands, also included the right for Christian missionaries to travel and preach throughout China. This is of course, in reference to their murdered French missionary, which was the main catalyst for France getting involved in the war. This marked a turning point in religious freedom within China, as Christianity associated with foreign powers was now officially sanctioned in the empire, which obviously the Chinese didn't like, but they didn't have a choice because they got crushed in this war. And the final key provision is the land rights and border adjustments for Russia. So Russia, which had not directly participated in the war, used the opportunity to negotiate with the weakened Qing government for territorial gains. Under separate agreements known as the Convention of Peking, Russia gained control over the Amur region of the Amur River and expanded its territory in the Russian Far East. This land cession resulted in the Russian Empire gaining significant new territory in what is now the Russian Far East, particularly the area surrounding Vladivostok. Now, the wars are over. China lost terribly. Britain and France were very happy. Let's talk about some of the lasting effects in China of the Opium Wars. So, the loss of sovereignty and unequal treaties were common during these wars. The Treaty of Nanking and the Treaty of Peking were the first of many unequal treaties that limited Chinese sovereignty and placed foreign powers above Chinese law. These treaties forced China to cede territory like Hong Kong and Kowloon, made them pay heavy indemnities, open ports for foreign trade, as we already talked about. This erosion of sovereignty greatly reduced the Qing government's control and prestige, making it increasingly difficult for the Chinese leadership to govern effectively. Let's get into trade imbalance. The treaties granted foreign powers control over Chinese trade and markets, especially for British goods such as opium, which was now legalized. Legalized opium imports led to widespread addiction, which debilitated a large part of the Chinese population and drained China's economy. The constant outflow of silver to pay for opium purchases caused severe economic strain, exacerbating poverty and weakening the government's fiscal stability. Foreign-controlled ports, including Shanghai and Canton, became hubs of international commerce, with profits largely going to foreign merchants. This dynamic weakened China's economic independence and worsened the imbalance in trade. Let's get into the rise of anti-foreign sentiment. The humiliation and devastation of the wars particularly acts like the burning of the Summer Palace in 1860, deeply impacted the Chinese psyche. The foreign presence was increasingly seen as exploitative and corrupting, and resentment toward foreign influence began to build across various segments of Chinese society. This anti-foreign sentiment laid the groundwork for uprisings and rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion, both of which were partly fueled by anger towards foreigners and their influence over the Qing government. China was obviously very upset with the Qing government's perceived weakness in these wars, which led to the weakening of the Qing dynasty and social instability. The Opium Wars and their treaties that followed eroded the authority of the Qing dynasty, exposing its inability to protect China from foreign powers and creating a crisis of legitimacy. Many Chinese people, especially in the educated classes, saw the government as corrupt and ineffective, leading to a loss of respect and loyalty toward the ruling dynasty. The weakening of central authority and continued foreign intervention led to a power vacuum in many regions, causing social instability and worsening poverty. Regional power brokers and warlords gained prominence, which eventually contributed to the fragmentation of Chinese political power in the early 20th century. Continuing on the lasting effects of the Opium Wars, we have the spread of Western influence and the self-strengthening movement. Although resented, Western presence did bring exposure to new technologies, political ideas, and knowledge. Missionaries introduced Western education and Christianity, as we know, and the opening of treaty ports exposed some Chinese elites to Western science, military techniques, and governance models. In response to China's defeats, a faction within the Qing government promoted the self-strengthening movement, aiming to modernize the military and economy by adopting Western technologies while retaining traditional Confucian values. However, this movement achieved only limited success due to conservative resistance within the government, poor funding, and a lack of comprehensive reform. On to Chinese nationalization. The humiliations China suffered during the Opium Wars and subsequent foreign invasions became key events that inspired Chinese nationalism. Intellectuals and reformers began to push for major changes to prevent China from falling under foreign domination again. Figures like Sun Yat-sen drew on these sentiments, calling for the end of dynastic rule and the establishment of a modern republic. The sense of humiliation and loss eventually led to the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, and spurred the revolutionary movements that sought to transform China into a modern nation-state, independent of foreign control. Chinese foreign policy. The memory of the Opium Wars and the Century of Humiliation has had a long-lasting impact on China's modern foreign policy. Chinese leaders have often emphasized sovereignty, territorial integrity, and resistance to foreign interference, which was directly influenced by the painful experiences of the 19th century and the Opium Wars. Today, China's emphasis on national pride and assertive international standing partly stems from the need to prevent a repeat of these historical experiences. The government promotes the idea of China's rejuvenation to restore the dignity that was lost during the Opium Wars. And finally, the legacy of Hong Kong's colonial history. The Opium Wars marked the beginning of Hong Kong's history as a British colony, a legacy that shaped its economic and cultural identity. When Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, it brought with it a distinct legal system, economy, and culture. The history of British rule in Hong Kong remains a sensitive issue within China, influencing its one country, two systems policy and current tensions surrounding Hong Kong's autonomy. And that brings us to the works cited page. So here we have some of the sources I used. Up here at the top is a article I read, which helped me learn more about the production of opium itself and how it was distributed and used within China and East India. The second article here was very helpful as far as like foreign relations between China and Britain, how battles played out, dates, names, things like that. Third source here, some of the same stuff. This time, this article was very helpful for discussing the Second Opium War. And then we have a book here, The Unwelcome Immigrant, which I got from the MCC library, which is an account from a Chinese person living within the Opium War era. Very interesting insights there. Lots to draw upon from that book. Just some first-hand accounts of the events. Very interesting. And another book I got from the library, The Opium War. This one was the biggest contributor to my research. I read this whole book and I took a lot from it. It went in depth on a lot of the wars. It went in depth on opium itself. Or not, battles, not wars, sorry. It did go in depth on the first Opium War, gave very significant key details that I used throughout the presentation. And finally, this last source is just another article that I drew upon for a lot of my research. Here we just have my sources for all the images I used, like the cartoons and the images of the old paintings, things like that. And these are the rest of the figures I used. I hope you enjoyed. I had a lot of fun doing this project. I'm very happy I chose this topic. It's very interesting, very history rich with lots of content. I could probably make a 3-hour presentation with all this content. I kind of had to cut myself off to keep it under 3 hours, but I had a lot of fun and I enjoyed this project, and I hope you enjoyed.